Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is another episode of We the Govern. And today I'm going to be talking about what has been just recently in the news with a Truth Social post by Trump. And this specifically has to do with the this post right here you see over here. I'm going to kind of move my screen down here a little bit, right up here. And Trump basically said that he's going to, and this happened just over the last few days, Trump said he's going to lead a movement to eliminate mail-in voting, or all mail-in voting, or mail-in voting. It's basically what he said here. It's a fairly long Truth Social post, and there were a lot of media stories you can see about it. Didn't matter if it was Newsmax or Politico. Everybody was responding to this issue. And if you live in Washington State, like I do, then mail-in voting is a big deal here because this is the mess that we get to look at and see and deal with every single time there's an election in Washington State. And since 2011, it's all been mail-in voting, although the majority of people have actually been mail-in voting in Washington State going back to the 1990s. It was just that the Washington State legislature changed the law in 2011 to make it mandatory everywhere. And a little trivia question here in Washington State, the very last county to actually go down this road, it was forced kicking and screaming, was actually Pierce County. So let's talk about a little bit about mail-in voting, and I think this matters a lot because people are going to be discussing these issues. Right now, you're going to hear about it in the media. There is, at the time I'm recording this video, there's no official executive order, and there's certainly a lot of questions as to what kind of an impact an executive order could even have on this process, just based on some of the constitutional restrictions of what the president could change or could not change. But as somebody who's actually done a lot of work with election integrity and issues in Washington State, let's just review the situation as it exists in Washington State now about mail-in voting in general and how people have kind of sold this to us in the past. Now, when you look at these surveys, and again, I'm going to point it out right up here, the number one benefit that most people will view that mail-in voting has is the convenience. And it's hard to dispute this because it is very convenient. Surveys have shown everybody really likes the convenience of mail-in voting. And it was and honestly, just even personally, back in the late 1990s, before mail-in voting became dominant everywhere, I had voted in precincts before. But I was traveling around internationally a lot at the time, and for some small business manufacturing work that I did. And I thought it was great because I signed up to be one of the first people to be permanent mail-in absentee ballots, is what they called it back then. And I signed up for that because I was traveling internationally a lot, and that allowed me to be able to vote even if I was traveling. And I thought, wow, this is great. I don't have to sign up for it each time. It's just really convenient. And so convenience is the primary selling pitch for mail-in voting for the most part, wherever it's tried. Now, the second selling benefit that usually gets promoted as to why people like mail-in voting is that, in theory, it's supposed to reduce the cost and complexity of the election process because you don't have all these scattered precincts where people are voting in their local school district or some other church or whatever has been set up as a local precinct. And that's scattered all over the county, and so you have all of these hundreds of different locations, and instead you're standardizing it and focusing it in one location, which is why the other benefit that it's usually sold for, at least for people who are kind of on the inside of the election process, is that this means that the local auditor's office is going to have a much higher trained and very specifically highly trained and supervised people who are actually doing the election counting. So it's a little bit less amateur hour out in these various precincts all scattered around the county where the election results are being tabulated. So this is an argument that has been sold to us for all mail-in voting. And then, of course, the other element of it is that every single thing is paper. It's not electronic. It's actually done on paper. And in theory, that gives us the ability then to go back and review what's actually happened. So you have an auditable trail. That's the theory. So these are the positive benefits that mail-in voting has usually kind of used to promote it as a dominant way of of doing elections. So that's been the dominant reasons. Now let's talk about the problems, because this is something in Washington State, since we are 100% all mail-in voting, and there's elements of what Washington State does in its mail-in voting system that's even particularly pernicious, and we can talk about that a little bit as we go along. But one of the biggest problems with mail-in voting has been, for a long time, the fact that there's essentially no chain of custody. There is absolutely no way, the minute those ballots are printed and widely distributed like confetti at a parade all over Washington State, nobody has any idea who actually gets the ballot, if they actually get the ballot, who's actually filling out and voting the ballot, and whether or not that ballot gets back and what's happened to it along the way. You have no way of knowing if somebody strong-armed a room full of people to fill out a ballot the way they wanted them to. You have no way of knowing whether that person ever was the person who actually filled out the ballot. And of course, that lack of chain of custody is probably one of the biggest arguments against mail-in voting, because that's one of the reasons. Usually several of the countries that have tried mail-in voting and rejected it later on, this was usually the dominant reason why they decided they didn't want to do it. But it isn't true. One of the things that I think Trump had mentioned was that, no countries do it. Well, there are some countries that do some mail-in voting. It has been rejected in a lot of places because of the problems that they've uncovered. But there are some countries that try it, or at least partially try it. And by the way, I want to highlight a fact here. I don't believe even under Trump's, if he does do an executive order, or even under the movement to eliminate mail-in voting as a dominant way of voting, do they really mean eliminating all mail-in voting? Because inevitably there'll probably be a limited amount of mail-in voting, even in precinct-level sort of voting systems, because you're going to have especially deployed military soldiers overseas, and you're also going to have disabled people who might have an inability to get out of a home or something because they're in a wheelchair, or they're just so disabled that they can't go out and do it. So I think you're still going to have kind of a limited subset of people that would be technically mail-in voting, even if the dominant voting system went back to a precinct in-person ID voting system, which is, those of us who care about election integrity, that's generally the approach that most of us want to see. The other challenge, of course, is that the mail-in voting, especially an all mail-in voting system like Washington State, it relies on the competency and honesty and just basic functionality of the U.S. Postal Service, which has been obviously decaying over the last few years. So when you see big piles of ballots in ditches or spread all over homeless camps, as we found in the past, or as I identified in a video a few months ago in Renton, when the Renton post office just decided they weren't going to deliver the ballots to the King County elections, you're going to see these kind of scenarios as a problem. I mean, every single week you can see posts up on the U.S. Post Office, Postmaster Inspector General, where they're catching postal workers who are committing fraud or doing something dishonest and they're being prosecuted. To believe that those people are perfect angels and they would never, ever in any way interfere with your ballots is just not really a realistic thing. You've just exposed in the election process, by relying entirely on this government bureaucracy, there's going to be risk there as to whether or not the system's going to operate effectively, and you've kind of outsourced now part of it, not just to the bureaucrats running the elections, but to now this other bureaucracy and actually getting the ballots to you and actually back. So now, we do make up for that a little bit in Washington State. I believe over half the people in Washington, might be higher now, actually don't use the post office to return their ballots. They get the ballots that way, but then typically they'll go down and do what I do, which is go and hand deliver it directly to the drop box by the auditor's office. That's not in-person voting, for those who are kind of confused about it, but at least it allows you to cut out the middleman and the post office, just like many of us have bills that don't seem to show up, or cards that disappear somehow before they ever get to our mailbox. This is a way to bypass it, and you go directly there and you drop it off. So some people do find ways of bypassing it, but you don't totally get away from it. Now, the other problem, of course, it is a drawn-out process by design. This is a little bit more complicated in Washington State because some states have said that, and this is the better way if you're going to do mail-in voting, that you have to receive those mail-in ballots by election night. And what our state does is we allow them to collect, it theoretically needs to be postmarked by election day, which they don't really enforce very well or effectively. And instead it gets long and drawn out, and that's why on election day, on a big election, it takes sometimes a month to collect all the ballots as the incompetency or problems with the post office drag out and the ballots don't show up till later, or you're discovering super secret stashes of ballots in election workers' trunks like King County seems to do on a regular basis, or other problems like this. It becomes kind of a strange thing. Now, Here's the other problem. This is one of the challenges in Washington State very specifically when it comes to election voting, is that we have a limited ability, and it's a very limited ability, to properly observe or audit the elections in our state. And one of the reasons when I say that is that although election observers are allowed sometimes, in part of the process there, it's not like it used to be in a precinct where you would have representatives in theory of both parties there, and they could observe everything going on. They could observe that people were coming in, that they were showing their ID properly, that they were indeed on the voter rolls, they were going back and they were voting, and you could see how the ballots were counted after the fact in these limited settings. Instead, what we see now is a much more remote and removed process. Now, I realize some counties in Washington State are better than others, but we've had plenty of problems in Washington State where they won't allow election observers to be close enough to actually see what's going on. They're forced to stand 20, 30 yards back sometimes, and so you're just you'd need a telescope to actually see whether the counting's being done properly or not. That's one of the issues. Of course, you have the situation in Island County where they also seem to weaponize, if you're of the wrong political party, they can weaponize the bureaucracy there and the corruption of prosecutors to decide to harass and charge prisons or criminal charges against people for not wearing a mask, for example. You also, though, have the problem ever since a series of court decisions in Washington State used to be, until these decisions a number of years ago, that you could actually go back and, as a public record, look through the ballots and look and see if they were counted properly after the fact. And there's a very limited way of doing that now, and it's been substantially curtailed and limited. For instance, and I'll go back in history a little bit, during the Bush-Gore issues where there was a little bit more of a drama related to that election, one of the things that happened is many media operations went back to Florida after the election was over, and they went back and reviewed the ballots themselves to see if they had been counted properly, because they were treated as a public record. And this was a fairly big deal. They were able to go back and actually look at it. Well, in Washington State, you'll never be able to do that. You could arguably do it if you were the candidate and you were willing to pay an exorbitant amount of money. That's about the only way to do it. But ever since, it was a series of decisions that several judges, and I believe they've been overly interpreted in a way that's not accurate, but they basically said there's no way you can go back and look at these ballots again. And so what it means is essentially, as each of these little layers of restrictions and ability to look at what's happened in the election process, you get restricted more and more and more, the transparency and auditability vanishes. And that's what's happened in Washington State. It's become very, very difficult to effectively audit anything that goes on. Now, we've done randomized sampling of audits of specific precincts to see if the count's been accurate. We got all kinds of other things that have been going on that we've been trying to do a lot of in our state in the last few years, but continually and almost with a relentless kind of path, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General's office, and most of the big auditors like King, Thurston, and Spokane have really leveraged their power and influence to restrain and restrict the ability of people to have any transparency or awareness of what's actually going on with these ballots. So it's one of those other challenges that you see here when you're actually looking at this. Now, this has been a real issue. The other thing, of course, at the end of the day, and this was this thing that Trump had emphasized there, was the simplicity, or at least the ease, of cheating. And I think it's important for people to be more realistic about this. Wherever humans are going to be involved in anything, if they believe there's some kind of advantage they can get for power, money, and control, they will take advantage of those opportunities to cheat, and that includes in person with vote ID. There are ways to cheat in almost every scenario that you could come up with to run elections, but you can certainly make cheating a lot more difficult, and a big part of that is making it transparent and observable for everybody. And this lack of transparency and observability and chain of custody in the mail-in voting system is really the big reason why many of us are really concerned about it, because it doesn't allow you to ever have any kind of auditability. And one of the things the supporters of mail-in voting will oftentimes say, and it's repeated endlessly because it's a primary talking point that's been fed out to the traditional media, was nothing's ever been proven that there's fraud going on in mail-in voting elections. And that's not true. There's plenty of examples of fraud that has happened for every single election. They discover 11 dead people just voted in King County just in this primary section. Now, they voted after death, and that's actually not really an easy way to vote, but obviously somebody else filled it out. They were able to catch it, at least those 11. Who knows how many other people they didn't catch. And, there's always examples. Now, then what they'll say is well, it's de minimis and it doesn't really mean that much, right? It's a limited amount of examples of problems or election cheating or whatever it is that's going on. But it is false to say that they haven't found examples of this. They found lots of examples in many states. It's endless, really. The question is how significant it is. In some cases, it's not that significant. In other cases, they just simply won't allow you ever to have the ability to go back and audit properly anything that's happening. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of problems with the whole process here of mail-in voting. The bigger question related to Trump's Truth Social post, and I support the objective of eliminating mail-in voting. I think that it's become very problematic. It's also failed in a lot of its fundamental promises. One of the big promises that they had for mail-in voting, supposedly, was it was going to improve voter turnout, which it hasn't done. That was a big selling point. I remember when they pitched it, they were really concerned. They said this is going to increase voter turnout. Based on the numbers, that's not true. And especially look at Washington State's recent primary elections. All mail-in voting, every single policy that anybody would ever want, especially on the leftist sort of political perspective, and the turnout was abysmal. In fact, apathy is widespread. 70% of Washington State voters decided that they didn't even want to participate. That is not an example of a healthy election system. That is an example of something that is failing to deliver anything that it has promised to deliver. So then, of course, we have to look at what really can Trump do as president on this issue. And this is the big question, right? Because one of the things that people are talking about these problems, and I agree and support these, and there's actually more complexity to this, but really what we've had in Washington State is this big showdown here between Ferguson and Trump, or at least that's our current makeup. Before him, it was going to be Inslee, Ferguson, and Trump, but it's essentially Trump versus people like Ferguson, who essentially are never going to fix anything in Washington State, no matter what, and in fact, anything that Trump says, they're going to always be on the opposite side of that idea. So the question is, if Trump signs some kind of executive order, what can he really do? I'm not confident, and I think I generally share the policy as much as I support that idea of eliminating mail-in voting. I don't think that you can do this through an executive order. It's very different. I think the feds can actually do quite a bit to clean up voter rolls, and there's a strong history over 150 years of actually stepping into states with screwed up voter rolls and trying to clean up that process. And there's a good historical and legal and constitutional history in fixing those kind of problems in states like Washington or others. The Democrats used to do this a lot in the Reconstruction South when they were trying to prevent freed slaves and later on children of slaves and Republicans from voting, and they had all kinds of games that they would use to prevent people from voting in the Reconstruction Jim Crow South. And the Democrats were very successful in preventing other people from voting, but the feds have stepped in over the years many times to try to fix and address those issues. The question is, though, when it comes to mail-in voting, can you actually do that via an executive order? And I don't think that that's the path that you can do it. You can probably go down, there's probably more of an argument that he can make, because he also brought up some problems with electronic machines and critical infrastructure and some of the public comments that have come out about machines, the ability to hack machines, for example. But in a state like Washington, where you do have the paper trail, it is there, and you can go back and audit. It's less of a problem in our state that the machine that you might use counting machines. It's more of a problem that the whole mail-in system exists in the first place. You can't verify any chain of custody or anything related to it. So the question is, how would they actually go about doing it? It's very clear that if you had Congress, both the House and the Senate, they decide, okay, we're going to change this, you could change it that way. But right now, with states like Washington that won't cooperate, I'm not sure that you're going to eliminate mail-in voting via an executive order. But it's certainly raising the question again that there's a lot of problems to be exposed here in the mail-in voting process. I support eliminating mail-in voting. I think in-person voting with ID to prove that you are who you say you are, that you're not voting under duress, that it's actually you voting and not relying on the post office to lose your ballot on the way to the election office or conveniently disappear in an election worker's trunk. I think that the transparency and the ease of observing on one day instead of for months the whole process of election, I think that there's a lot of benefits to going back to that kind of a system. But I'm not sure that Trump having an executive order would get us there. It's clear that Congress could get us there. Could they really do that before the 2026 midterms? Probably that'd be unlikely. It'd be a stretch, but who knows? I mean, we're living in interesting times, and so we don't know where it's going. But I think it is important for those of us who do want to get back to proof of citizenship, in-person voting, and knowing that you can only vote once, that that it's being very transparent that this is a path we want to go down. I'm not sure that Trump can do it with an executive order. It doesn't look that way to me, but let's see where it goes. And this is going to be a big fight. It's not going to end here. It's not going to end with a post on Truth Social or an executive order. Inevitably, there's going to be a lot of legal battles over this thing moving forward, but it is an amazing step down the road towards at least being aware of some of the issues when it comes to elections. And in Washington State, this is a big deal where I live, and for many people watching this video where you live too. And it's going to make a big change if we're able to actually change this method of voting and at least restrict it to maybe just deployed military or severely disabled people. And I think that would be a good compromise to get to if we could get there. But that's my update for now. Again, if you want to make a difference on these issues, you have to stay engaged, involved. There's no super successful last-minute Sunday afternoon special 2-hour solution to all the world's problems. It doesn't happen that way. It takes a lot of people to get involved and be engaged. You have to be willing to show up because, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up. So get out there and show up and tell people what you think about this issue. And I'm curious if you have any other input, please leave your comments down below. I do read as many of them as you post up, and I try to respond to most of those as well. And again, just don't forget, this isn't the time to be apathetic. This is the time to be showing up and making a difference. Thank you so much for watching.